My father looked at me across the candlelit table and said, "We only invited you out of pity, Mara. Don't make it awkward by staying too long." He said it at his 65th birthday dinner, in front of my cousins, his business partners, and the woman who had already called me unstable twice that week. I smiled, set his unopened gift beside the dessert menus, and left before the first toast. 5 days later, the old print shop he had tried to use as collateral was sold, his company accounts were restricted, and the first lawyer's letter reached his office before lunch. My name is Mara Ellis. I was 36 then, a compliance manager for a hospital system in Oregon, which meant I spent my working life catching small errors before they turned into expensive disasters. The irony was that my own family had spent years calling that same skill paranoia. The property at the center of everything was not a beach house or a mansion. It was a 3-story brick print shop in Astoria, Oregon, left to me by my grandfather, Samuel Reed. He had run a tiny maritime newspaper there for almost 40 years. To my father, that building was a future event space. To me, it was the last place where someone in my family had treated my caution like intelligence instead of a flaw. And if you've ever watched a toxic family call someone dramatic right before the paperwork proves them wrong, you'll understand why I stopped defending myself and started saving receipts. This is the kind of inheritance story people dismiss as family drama until the documents start talking. Grandpa Sam's will was painfully clear. The Reed print house was my separate property, not part of Ellis family assets, not available for company loans, and not subject to any vote by relatives. He even added one sentence in plain language. No one may pressure Mara to convert this gift into a family business asset. When the will was read, my father laughed like it was sentimental nonsense. My brother Drew said Grandpa had favored me because I acted helpless. My stepmother, Camille, squeezed my hand and whispered, "Don't let grief make you selfish." That was the first time I understood that their concern usually arrived right before they wanted something. I didn't cut them off. That was my mistake. My father owned Ellis Coastal Experiences, a struggling company that organized corporate retreats, seafood festivals, and expensive heritage weekends for executives who wanted rustic charm without actual inconvenience. I let him use the first floor of the print shop for a few seasonal events under a written license. No renovations without approval, no subleasing. No advertising the building as company-owned, no borrowing against it. My father signed every page. Then he behaved as if my signature meant obedience, not a boundary. Over the next 8 years, the violations became bolder. Drew gave private tours to investors. Camille hosted donor brunches there and referred to it as our family venue. My younger half-sister Lila staged engagement shoots beside Grandpa's old presses and posted captions about the Ellis legacy. When I objected, Dad would sigh and say, "You turn every generous arrangement into a legal trap." If I brought up the license, he called me cold. If I asked for schedules, Camille said I was spiraling. When I changed the back office lock after finding wine crates stacked against Grandpa's files, Lila told relatives I was guarding paper like a bunker. The first real warning came from a printer's drawer. Grandpa had kept hundreds of tiny metal-type pieces in shallow wooden cases. One Saturday, I went to Astoria to check a leak after a storm and noticed one drawer had been pulled halfway out, even though I always kept it latched. Inside was a folded sticky note I had never seen before. It said, "Mara, don't trust verbal promises. Ask about page 7. It was Grandpa's handwriting. I stared at it for several minutes, more angry than scared, because it meant he had anticipated a fight I had spent years pretending would never happen. Page 7 turned out to be in the original license agreement. It required my written consent for any bank, investor, insurer, or event client to review the property as a company asset. I emailed Dad a reminder that same night. He replied with one line, "You need to stop treating your family like criminals." Camille followed with a softer message. "Your father is worried about you. You've been suspicious since your grandfather died." She copied Drew and Lila. That was the pattern. Dad accused. Camille diagnosed. My siblings witnessed. Then everyone waited for me to apologize. 2 weeks before Dad's birthday dinner, an overnight envelope arrived at my apartment in Portland. It came from Cascadia Harbor Bank. Inside was a notice thanking me for my cooperation in an appraisal related to Ellis Coastal Experiences' proposed $2.75 million credit facility. The collateral schedule listed equipment, receivables, 2 company vans, and the Reed print house. My stomach went cold at the word cooperation. Attached was an owner consent form with my name typed under a signature that looked close enough to fool someone who had never seen me sign twice. I called the bank's risk department and asked for every document tied to my name. The woman on the phone became careful after I said the consent was forged. 48 hours later, a secure folder appeared in my inbox. My driver's license had been copied. A utility bill from my apartment had been attached. Someone had created an email address that looked like mine, with one extra dot between my first and last name, and used it to confirm that I supported the project. The appraisal described the print shop as a family-controlled historic venue scheduled for conversion into a boutique conference property. That was when I stopped arguing and started printing everything. The part that made the room feel smaller was not only the forgery, it was how much they knew about my private life. The fake email had answered the bank during a window when I was in a hospital compliance drill with my phone locked in a cabinet. Someone also knew my apartment address, my old utility account number, and the exact date I had renewed my driver's license. When Priya asked who in my family still had access to my shared calendar, I remembered an old emergency folder Camille had insisted we all maintain after Grandpa's stroke. I had never removed her. For months, she had been watching my appointments while telling everyone I was imagining things. I called Priya Nair, an estate attorney I knew through hospital policy work. She didn't gasp or tell me I was brave. She read in silence, highlighted dates, and asked one clean question. Do you want to keep giving them chances, or do you want to keep the building? I said I wanted the truth first. Priya told me the truth might be worse than the building. Then she found something I had missed. The fake email approving the appraisal had been sent the same afternoon. Camille texted me asking where I kept my old insurance paperwork. She had said she was updating emergency contacts for the family. The birthday dinner happened 3 days later at a private room inside a Portland steakhouse. I almost skipped it, but Priya said public behavior sometimes mattered, especially when a family had started building a record that I was unstable. I brought Dad a first edition maritime atlas Grandpa had once wanted him to have. I also brought my phone, set to record my own interactions where Oregon law allowed. Camille greeted me too brightly and touched my wrist. Let's have a calm night, she said. No property talk. Your father deserves peace. Then Dad delivered the pity line before I even sat down. For 1 second, the whole table held its breath. Drew smirked into his drink. Lila looked embarrassed, but did nothing. Camille murmured, Mara, don't react. That was worse than the insult. She had prepared everyone to watch me become the problem. I looked at Dad and said, I won't stay long. Then I placed the atlas beside his plate and walked out while 20 people pretended not to stare. In my car, I called Priya. My voice didn't shake until she answered. Start everything, I said. No more delays. The next 5 days moved with the kind of quiet speed that only legal work has. Priya notified Cascadia Harbor Bank that my consent had been forged and sent them the will, the license, my real signature samples, the fake email address, and the note from Grandpa's drawer. She also contacted the Astoria Literacy Trust, a nonprofit that had tried for years to buy the print shop and preserve it as a community archive. They already had donor funding, and because the title was clean, they could close fast. The forged bank documents had never created a valid lien. Dad had counted on intimidation moving faster than paperwork. He chose wrong. If you're here for inheritance revenge stories, where the quiet person finally has receipts, remember this part. The forged consent was not the document that frightened them most. The real threat was the old clause they had ignored because they thought I'd never use it. At 9:52 on Thursday morning, the sale closed for $1.36 million, with funds wired to an account Dad had never touched. The agreement protected the presses, the upstairs archive, and Grandpa's office from commercial redevelopment. At 10:11, Priya sent termination notices to Ellis Coastal Experiences, Dad, Drew, Lila, and Camille. At 10:18, Cascadia Harbor Bank restricted the temporary credit line they had extended based on the pending loan. At 10:26, the company's operating account was flagged for review because client deposits had been mixed with funds tied to the false appraisal. At 10:31, Drew called me 8 times. At 10:34, Lila texted, please tell me you didn't actually sell the building. At 10:40, Camille wrote, your father is afraid you're having some kind of episode. Where are you? At 10:47, Dad left a voicemail. His first words were calm. Mara, there's been a misunderstanding about paperwork. 2 minutes later, he called again. This time he was shouting, you had no right to sell my company's future. I saved both messages. Then I posted one statement in the family group chat. The Reed print house belonged to me under Grandpa's will. The sale is complete. Questions about forged consent forms, fake emails, or company accounts should go to Priya Nair. Drew answered first. You're accusing Dad of fraud because you got your feelings hurt at dinner? I typed, no. I'm reporting documents submitted to a bank with my name and identification. Lila wrote, that email came from you. I replied, it came from an address created to look like mine. Camille sent a voice message. She sounded near tears, but the words were too precise. Everyone, please remember Mara has been under stress. We need to be careful about taking her accusations literally. That sentence told me the instability story had not been emotional. It had been strategic. They needed witnesses to doubt me before the records reached them. That afternoon, my Aunt June called. She had avoided the birthday dinner because she said Dad's parties felt like board meetings with cake. She told me Camille had been quietly warning relatives that I was turning the Reed estate into a secret will. Conspiracy. She keeps saying you never recovered from the will reading, June said. Then she lowered her voice. But your grandfather made me promise something. Before his death, Grandpa had mailed her a storage receipt for a small archive box and told her to give it to my attorney if anyone tried to challenge my ownership. Priya picked it up the next morning. Inside were duplicate copies of the page 7 clause, Dad's old debt agreement, and a letter that said, Mara will be pressured most by people who call pressure love. By noon, Ellis Coastal Experiences was bleeding consequences. A tech company canceled a 3-day leadership retreat after learning the print shop was not available. 2 vendors froze deliveries until payment cleared. A historic preservation board member called Priya to say Lila had shown them concept art for Ellis Press House Hotel, including rooftop dining, 12 suites, and a members-only whiskey room. My grandfather's office, the room everyone had told me was too dusty to enter, appeared in those renderings as a founder's lounge. I had never approved 1 inch of it. That evening, Dad came to my apartment building with Camille and Drew. My front desk called because they were demanding access to my floor. I told security to place them in the resident conference room and called Priya on video. Dad hated that immediately. This is not a deposition, he said. Priya answered, no, it's a documented family meeting about a forged property consent. Camille closed her eyes like the word forged offended her manners. Drew leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, trying to look bored. He looked terrified. Dad started with the version meant to make me small. He said Grandpa had left me the building only because I was unmarried and emotionally delicate. He said the company had improved the property and created value. He said selling it without family discussion was legal theft. Priya asked for receipts showing company improvements to the building. Camille produced invoices for flowers, temporary lighting, linens, and a champagne wall. I opened my own folder. I had paid property taxes, roof repairs, flood insurance, electrical upgrades, pest control, and archive climate control for 8 years. My total was $143,800. Their improvements were party decorations billed to the company. Then Drew made the mistake of bragging. We had investors ready. This could have saved all of us. Priya asked. Saved you from what? Nobody answered. So she turned her screen and displayed the bank's preliminary ledger. The temporary credit had already paid overdue payroll taxes, a delinquent van loan, Drew's travel reimbursements, and $37,000 to Lila's marketing studio for brand development. The print shop was not just an expansion dream. It was the cover story for a company that had been running out of cash. Dad pointed at me. You're risking 29 jobs because you wanted revenge. Priya asked, how many full-time employees does the company have? Drew muttered, 9. The rest were contractors used during events. Dad had inflated the number because he knew exactly which guilt would work on me. I worked in a hospital system. I knew what job loss did to families. For a moment, I almost apologized for consequences I had not created. Then I remembered the fake email, the copied license, and Grandpa's note in the printer's drawer. I said, you used my name like equipment. Dad slammed his palm on the table. Your grandfather would be ashamed. That was when I opened the second file Priya had helped me digitize. After finding the note about page 7, I had gone back to the print shop and searched Grandpa's office. Behind a loose panel under the old composing table, I found a thumb drive taped to the wood. It contained scanned letters, an audio file, and a signed agreement from 12 years earlier. My father had borrowed $210,000 from Grandpa after a failed convention contract. In exchange for forgiving half the debt, Dad signed a document acknowledging that he would never claim ownership, control, or future proceeds from the Reed print house. I pressed play on the audio. Grandpa's voice came through thin and scratchy, but steady. Mara, if your father ever says the building belongs to the family, ask him why he signed away that claim before you inherited it. Camille covered her mouth. Drew stared at Dad. For the first time in my life, my father looked cornered by someone who was not even alive anymore. He tried to reach for the laptop. Priya said, do not touch evidence. He sat back slowly, his face red. And that was the moment I understood why people subscribe to revenge stories like this. Not because the loudest person wins, because sometimes the person everyone called unstable is the only one who kept the proof. Dad said the agreement was old and irrelevant. Priya corrected him. It was directly relevant to whether he knowingly misrepresented authority to the bank. Camille whispered, Graham, you said Samuel never put that in writing. Dad snapped, not now. That tiny exchange opened another door. Camille had known there was a dispute. She had not misunderstood. She had chosen not to ask questions because the answer might stop the loan. Drew left first, cursing under his breath. Camille stayed long enough to ask whether I would tell the bank this was an internal confusion. I looked at her and said, you spent 2 months telling people I was unstable so no one would believe me. That wasn't confusion. That was preparation. She started crying. I didn't move toward her. I had spent years confusing her tears with proof that she cared. That day, they only looked like another tool she had picked up because the first one failed. 2 days later, Lila asked to meet me at a coffee shop near the hospital. She arrived without makeup, which, in my family, meant she wanted to look honest. She admitted she had created the hotel renderings, but insisted Dad told her I had basically agreed. I asked about the fake email. She stared into her cup. I didn't make the address, she said. Drew did. According to her, Drew created it to calm an investor who wanted written confirmation from the owner. Camille supplied a scanned copy of my driver's license from old family emergency files. Lila attached the renderings. Dad approved the final packet. They had turned my identity into a team project. Why tell me? I asked. Because Dad is blaming me. Not because she was sorry. Because the fire had reached her side of the room. The bank denied the credit facility the next morning and demanded repayment of the temporary advances within 30 days. It also referred the forged consent and fake email to its fraud review council. Ellis Coastal Experiences could keep operating only through a monitored account, with no distributions to family members. The company attorney recommended an independent restructuring plan. Dad told relatives I had destroyed his life over a birthday joke. Camille called me vindictive. Drew said I was weaponizing paperwork. I sent anyone who contacted me the same sentence. My property was used in a loan application without my consent. I will cooperate with official reviews and will not debate family rumors. The final confrontation happened in a rented conference room at a title company, not a courtroom, which somehow made it worse. Fluorescent lights, cheap coffee, a wall clock that ticked too loudly. Dad arrived with his attorney and the confidence of a man who still believed pressure could replace facts. He wanted me to sign a statement saying the disputed documents resulted from miscommunication among family members. In exchange, he would stop threatening to sue over business interference. Priya slid the forged consent, the fake email logs, Grandpa's signed agreement, and the audio transcript across the table. Dad didn't look at them. You enjoyed humiliating me, I said. I enjoyed not being controlled by you. His attorney cleared his throat. The bank's representative, who had joined by video, explained that repayment would be required, the pending loan was dead, and the company's leadership would have to change before any future banking relationship could continue. Drew would lose his development role. Dad would resign as managing director. Lila's marketing contract was being reviewed because her renderings had been sent to investors without owner approval. Camille's access to company accounts would be suspended during the audit. Dad turned to me. So this is your revenge story? No, I said. This is what happens when a stolen inheritance meets a paper trail. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended him. Even his attorney looked down at the table. Then the bank representative asked one final question. Who authorized the email account impersonating Miss Ellis? Dad said nothing. Drew shifted in his chair. Lila started crying. Camille whispered, Graham, tell them it wasn't Mara. That was the reversal. Not an apology, not love, just fear strong enough to make the lie less useful than the truth. Dad finally said, I believed I had family authority. Priya replied, family authority is not a legal instrument. The consequences were not instant fireworks. They were slower and more humiliating. Ellis Coastal Experiences survived, but barely. An outside manager took control. The hotel concept died. Company vehicles were sold. Drew found a sales job with a vendor who did not give him a title to hide behind. Lila's studio lost 2 clients after the investor complaint became impossible to explain. Camille moved out for 3 months, then moved back, then called me to say she was working on accountability. I told her accountability would have to exist without access to me for a while. My father never apologized. He mailed one letter saying I had chosen strangers over blood and paperwork over forgiveness. I didn't open it. Priya returned it with a note saying future contact should go through council. The Reed Print House became a public archive and literacy center. The old presses stayed. Grandpa's office stayed. The upstairs room where Dad had imagined velvet chairs and whiskey lockers became a reading room for local students. I donated copies of Grandpa's recordings, including the one that protected me. The first time I visited after the transfer, a volunteer had placed a small sign near the composing table. Words matter. Records matter. I stood there longer than I meant to. I used part of the sale proceeds to buy a smaller condo closer to work. I used another part to start a preparedness fund for hospital employees dealing with sudden legal or financial crises. Wills, medical proxies, emergency contacts, property records, things people avoid until the worst week of their lives. It felt right. Grandpa had not left me the building just so I could win a family argument. He had left me proof that I was allowed to protect what was mine. I still think about the birthday dinner. Not because the pity line was the cruelest thing my father ever said, but because it was the clearest. For years, they had mistaken my patience for permission. They thought if they called me unstable enough, I would hand them my inheritance just to prove I was reasonable. They thought the quiet daughter would rather be loved badly than be free. They were wrong. So what would you have done if your family used your name, your property, and your silence to build their future, then called you unstable when you found the proof? Would you forgive a father who treated your inheritance like collateral, or would you let the documents speak for you? Comment your answer, because I genuinely want to know where people draw the line with toxic family. Thank you for staying with my story. If you like inheritance stories where families lie, quiet women keep receipts, and revenge comes through proof instead of cruelty, subscribe to her confession room. There are more stories waiting.